So here we are.
Here we are.
Episode 6 of Friday Night Rants and Bants.
On a Tuesday.
Keeping
the theme running.
There is no Friday Night Rants and Bants on a Friday.
I think there was one.
We did one. I think
What one was
maybe
that?
the Pokemon one?
Yeah, that doesn't count. It's non-canon.
It's non-canon.
This is the first
It's been removed from the chronology.
Yeah, this is the first real canon, like, next installment of the podcast.
Right.
The first one, Game of Thrones, and then this one. We're back.
We're skipping...
2 hosts, baby!
We're skipping the interquels, are we?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
So, like, episode 1, canon. 2,
2,
3, 4, 5, non-canon. We Disneyed them.
They're like the new Star Wars. Yeah, they're like the new Star Wars.
Destroyed those, put them in the incinerator, deleted them, destroyed the system.
It's like the expanded universe. It's just
exactly.
Yeah.
Delete the system 32, crash the computer, destroy
Empty
it.
recycle bin.
Oh, fuck's sake, don't get me on that. And now we're here, we're back.
We're here back as it should be.
Yes.
As it always was intended to be. The true Rants and Bants experience.
The 2 true shads.
Pure and wholesome. As it should.
Kino.
None of that light, funny comedy.
None of that.
This is serious.
Yeah.
Serious discussion.
Deep video game analysis. When I'm in game,
I am a gamer.
I am a gamer. When I'm in game, I'm not just killing dragons. I am killing dragons.
Wow. Considering the fact that the first episode was not about games, so...
Actually, that is true.
I don't know if it really counts that this is...
So does that mean that this is non-canon as well?
No, this will always be
this
canon.
This is always canon.
And I just want to just go lead in with an apology to all Silent Hill fans who've clicked on this thinking this will be interesting because I want to see how he considers this one against the first one.
Yeah, there's going to be none of that.
Because I was not allowed to have the first Silent Hill as the first game that we played, in this series.
Because I forbid it.
You forbid it. Why did you forbid it?
Well, okay, I've never played a Silent Hill game before, and this is where you add in like the post, like live audience reaction, gasping and whatnot.
Right. Okay.
I missed that, so I had a PS2 growing up, but wasn't quite old enough to get all of those sort of like mature games in quotations. So I grew up on Jak and Jak and Daxter.
But did not play Ratchet and Clank.
Didn't play Ratchet and Clank.
Still ashamed of you.
I know. I played the Gladiator one or whatever.
Okay,
that
well,
counts.
As long as we've crossed that one off the list.
So I missed Silent Hill. Mm-hmm. And forever it's been on my list. And then you recommended that we play them together. And of course, when I think famous horror games, famous PS2 games, immediately go to Silent Hill 2.
See, that's interesting because I think a lot of people would not think of that as their first impression.
Really?
A lot of people will go, Resident Evil. And Silent Hill, people will be like, oh, it's just this weird game. If there's a movie of it, I guess the games are based on the movie.
See, that's interesting to me. Because, like, when I think horror, I don't think Resident Evil.
I've never found Resident Evil scary.
No, but I guess it's like a generational thing, though. If you grew up, if that was, like, your first horror or mature, like, violent experience on the PS1, I suppose you probably would think it's horror. But now, 2020, looking back on it, it's a bit goofy.
Well, especially these days with Silent Hill, the way it is now, it's sort of just forgotten. It's like this forgotten legend that, like, people growing up these days will be like, oh, I know about Silent Hill. My friend who plays old games played Silent Hill, but I only know about it from PT and the possible cancelled Kojima game. Yeah. So they know sort of it, but they never actually played it. And I think that's a really important distinction because a lot of people go into it and go, yeah, it's this crazy sort of horror game about weird monsters. I think there's like a dude with a pyramid on his head. And that's generally all they know about it. And they don't really know anything else specific about Silent Hill besides, it's set in Silent Hill.
Yeah, well, that's basically me, I suppose. I knew enough about the series to know that, I knew there were 4 Japanese games developed by the same studio. Then I knew that there were the American ones, which we won't talk about.
No.
And then I obviously knew all of the recent controversy about, the Kojima, Guillermo del Toro, Norman Reedus one that was cancelled, and then all of that nonsense. So my understanding of the series was very, very limited. I think you showed me a bit of 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think we played the first 10 minutes.
10 minutes or something. Anyway, we decided to play 2.
Yes,
because I wanted to play 2,
and I think that was okay. I would have preferred probably to start with 1 just because of the sort of the graphical leap, and I think just the context helps.
Yeah.
But 2 is also okay as a starting point. just because it sort of doesn't relate to the other ones in a strong way.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that I figured is, if it works out, and it obviously did because we're here, then we can go backwards. So it's going to be an interesting order. We're going to go 2, 1, 3, 4.
2, 1, 3, 4, which I think is the way I might have done it actually when I first played them as well.
We're retracing your steps.
It is.
The true canon. It harkens back to the original.
A very emotional journey. It's like poetry. It's good. Right?
For fuck's sake. I think we've used that joke every fucking podcast.
Hey, gotta add it in. So we started playing Silent Hill 2. And before we started, what were your thoughts about what would be in this game? What would it involve? Because I know you said something about how scary you thought it was going to be beforehand. And
that's actually Pyramid Head knocking down the door right
now.
Good,
he's heard us.
Spoilers, guys. In case you didn't know, we actually have an extra host today. Our co-host, Pyramid Head.
Pyramid Head's joining us.
You know what? I just realised we skipped the intro. We skipped the glorious quiz. Oh. I don't know. You're now CWIS. Quiz. No, fuck! I forgot the R.
Well, I think anyone knows us by now.
Well, that is true.
Frankly,
that is true. This is canon, guys. Come on.
I'm James Sunderland, and
what?
And you're Mary.
Oh, I just got it. For fuck's sake! Why do I have to be Mary?
Well, you are wearing a pink shirt, so.
What does that mean?
Okay. Anyway.
Fuck you. I want to be the girl. What's her name? Laura.
Okay.
I survived. Fuck you.
Yeah, fair point.
Anyway, okay, moving forward.
So, going into the game, initially, you had some thoughts, I'm sure, about what was going to be involved in it. I know you said something about how scary you thought it was going to be from the start.
So, I knew very little about the game. I knew, obviously, where it was based. I know from talking to you previously that it generally has stuff to do with like the character's psyche and something that they've done, and it reveals something about them. Obviously, like that's the point of the game. I
think somewhat that applies.
Sort of like
more so to 2 than
to 2, yeah. But that's sort of the one that I knew the most about.
Right.
I knew that it was exploring his psyche, and that some sort of like from the couple of scenes that I had seen from YouTube clips or things that we've discussed. I knew that it had something to do with like something sexual. I didn't know if it was like rape specifically. I knew that there was these little hints and things throughout that it definitely had something to do with sex. But I thought that was like the primary subject matter, which we'll discuss later. Obviously.
Which, I won't spoil anything, but I think that applies more to later games than to this one specifically. I mean, obviously it is a factor, as we know, as you know now.
Yeah.
But I think it's more than just that, obviously.
Yeah.
I think it's
more...
for
2 it is, certainly, So I knew that, but going into it, when you play games, especially games that came out 19 years ago, 2001, it's insane, there's sort of this, I don't know, you sort of go in and you think, oh, well, this isn't going to have aged anywhere near as gracefully as you would optimistically hope. So I did not expect to be scared at all. I did not expect to be uncomfortable. I was expecting cool ideas. I sort of thought it would be something like watching an old horror film. Like if you flick on something, from say the 90s or the 80s or something, chances are it's probably pretty mundane compared to some of the stuff that's being made now, just because what is considered shocking.
Yeah, well, the cultural sort of, I guess, impression of what is scary, what is not.
And then you're also just like, as you move forward, what becomes acceptable to show, like that bar constantly moves. So, you go back to like the 70s or the 60s or whatnot, and you show like blood and violence and whatnot, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's shocking. And now you find like action and violence everywhere.
I mean, something like that back in, the day, like in the 80s, say, even pretty mild violence these days would be, an R18 plus rating back then. Or, like an adults only cinema or whatever. But here, nowadays, it's probably M rated.
Exactly.
Which is the case, I think, with a lot of the old...
well, you look at a lot of the old ratings for things, and they're like MA15 or M15, the old rating, or,
Like Exorcist is M now, I think.
Yeah. And you look at something like, I think Predator 2 is a great example as well. I think that's rated R.
Predator 1 is R as well.
Yeah, and now you go nowadays, and it's just a mature rating. Like, I could rate that to... anyone, and that like legally that's fine. So
I think for something besides the subject matter, some of the things in those movies might have been a bit daring these days.
Oh yeah, certainly.
Back then, of course.
I don't mean to discredit. Like obviously, like story beats and ideas and themes and whatnot can still be very relevant and equally disturbing or horrifying. But I mean more so like in the immediate visual sense. Like there are probably those odd ones out, but for the most part, I think that that's a pretty good statement. So I assume the same for Silent Hill. For Silent Hill 2, I thought that it would have things that I would appreciate of the time, but nothing that would actually get me and affect me to today. And I'm very pleased to say that that was not the case.
Definitely.
And that the game holds up surprisingly well, considering that it's nearly 2 decades old.
Yeah, I think it's something that shows the mark of something that was really considered when it was put into place. I mean, like nowadays, if it's still as effective as it is, I can only imagine how effective it would have been in 2001.
Oh, of course.
Like the generational jump from...
Well, the visuals... we'll move on to some of the technical things. So the game obviously came out in 2001, as you said. No, this is 3 years before Resident Evil 4. And I don't want to say comparable to Resident Evil 4, but it looks pretty darn fucking comparable.
I think...
to Resi 4. Like, obviously it doesn't have the free moving camera and stuff like that. And that probably helps them get away with a lot of techniques to render things, at
I think I did talk to you
detail.
before that a lot of the ways they sort of tricked the constraints they're working in was, I think each sort of room was kind of its own separate space that has to load in and sort of deload. So none of the large areas are ever sort of loaded in all together.
Seamlessly connected.
So there's, the buildings and stuff, they're all separately loaded. Each room uses the maximum amount of like CPU and graphical power that it can, which really helps with those small details.
Well, it's like... I am genuinely, like, just thinking about it, astonished as to how they got that looking that good in 2000. Like, this is 2001. At this point, like, high tier, like, we've got, like, Halo and a couple of other things which are, like, really, like, you think about those games, like, even Halo, you look at that, compare that to this.
I mean, something
it's
something like Halo is actually interesting to look at in comparison because it's kind of the exact opposite, where they have huge areas, but they're they're very basic in detail. They're all sort of just flat textures in squares.
Exactly.
So that you might have, this huge field, but there's nothing really in it.
Exactly.
Besides, some slopes and enemies.
And obviously, like character models and whatnot, they use a lot more sort of like jagged sort of shape. Like
simple shapes.
It's not horrible by any stretch of the imagination. I think the original Halo looks pretty darn good. But when you compare it, like this game wouldn't look too far out of place on the PS3, really. Like a slightly higher resolution with a little bit of reworking, you could get a pretty comparable product, I think.
Now, let's not talk about the HD collection.
Oh, yeah, no, stay away from that. I don't know if you agree with me on that statement about
No, I definitely do, because I think it definitely, at least more so than the sequels, which look worse than the originals, which is pretty impressive when you look at it.
When you say sequels, just to clarify.
Well, Homecoming and Downpour particularly, while they do have some decent-looking parts, I think a lot of the time they just lack in that sort of fine detail that is sort of important. Yeah. In these games.
And if I can give one really big thumbs up to the visual presentation of this game, that not only lends itself brilliantly to like the graphics themselves specifically, but then also just like the atmosphere. The lighting in this game is fucking incredible.
Yeah, I think that was the thing I disliked most about the HD collection was that I think it
removed a lot of the
effects on things like the fog, and I think at least the real-time lighting definitely got a huge downgrade. I just don't know if the version they were using couldn't handle it, or they were just incompetent coders, which is certainly possible. But it really did suffer, which I think is one of the main.
Because I heard a comment in a couple of places. I'm not 100% sure where. That's like we talk about next gen now in 2020, and obviously we're at the point where like photorealistic visuals are a thing that we can very nearly achieve. It's just crossing that gap between what we recognize as being real and fake, and the uncanny valley, etc. But I've heard that lighting is the next sort of step in terms of like the visuals moving forward,
which is kind of crazy to me because there have been a lot of games in the past which have had really good lighting. And it's just kind of fallen out of favor in favor of just like sort of pure fidelity. I think it's sort of been traded for something like, I guess, human realism. Like they focus more on making people look not, you know.
You focus on like the texture of the skin and you know the hair physics and things like that and whatnot. Yeah. Moving back to excuse me, but yeah, like the lighting in this game is incredible. Like it's not flawless. It's obviously 2001, so you only have so much power that you can work with. So in some of the corridors that you're walking in, I remarked that you can actually see like the individual like squares or so.
Yeah.
That the light is like the different, like the fade isn't flawless. You can see sort of the different gradients of the light, but still like we're walking through areas with like bars, like metallic bars.
Yeah, with like with hand railings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you can see the shadow that your torch is casting like move as you're moving. Like Fear, that you know, which is most famous for like its AI and its dynamic light, came out in 2004. You know what I mean? And like obviously, you can't really compare that to this game because Fear would win. But like to think that 3 years prior we still had something that like has that sort of effect, like to atmosphere and whatnot, and it's running on a console for starters with the specs are so much lower than the top tier PCs at the time, which then struggled to run Fear. Why, like, just to think that, like, artistic direction and like, it's just incredible. Like, the atmosphere in the game is incredible for a lot of other reasons, but yeah, visually, I think this game is fantastic.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the way that it sort of brings forth that atmosphere, for me, it has always been, I think, the sound design.
Yes.
So anyone who is keen into Silent Hill knows Akira Yamaoka, who is the one who did the soundtrack for every game up until Downpour, which was taken over by Korn. I don't know if they really actually did anything with the sound. I think they just provided like some song or some couple of songs for it.
Okay.
So I'm not sure specifically on how much they were involved, but it's a noticeable difference between them. Like even Homecoming, with all its issues, has some pretty decent sound design and points, despite the fact the rest of the game is kind of trash. But I think just the fact that there's this balance between the songs that are actually used and the sounds that are used.
And that's such an awesome thing. Like, this game blends soundtrack and like sound design really, like, just to provide an example for people, you think about a movie or perhaps another horror game, for example, and it's really easy to distinguish between what's happening in the world, as in the character that you're playing as, and a song that's happening outside of the world, something that you're meant to hear as the viewer, as the consumer of this media, but that your character in the world isn't going to hear. And then obviously there are some, sort of bridging points where it's like you're hearing like music in the game while playing on a radio or something like that. But back to those two extremes, so sort of one involves the character and one doesn't. And, it's fine. It works. It can add, it still impacts you as like the viewer, as the player. But it is a separation from the game, I think. And then you take something like this, which plays with that idea where it's, something that sounds like it could be in the game world. A scratching, a rumbling, a crashing, a banging is actually the soundtrack. And it plays so well to put you on edge because you're thinking to yourself, wait, is this a sound? Is this music? Is this something I'm listening to that I, the person external from this game, is experiencing? Or is this something happening in the world that I have to, worry about, audio, listen to it audibly and look for something visually? Like, just ideas like that are fantastic because it constantly keeps your gut waiting for something to happen, as opposed to, a normal cue in, say, a movie or a game where it's like, oh, there's music playing. Chances are something isn't going to happen here because you're not going to have like a jump or something.
Yeah, well, a good comparison is something like the Resident Evil safe rooms, which always have that sort of calming music to it. But in Silent Hill, that doesn't really mean anything.
No, it means nothing at all.
Because, there's that sort of switch between, like you said, whether or not this is actually supposed to be part of the game world or if it's supposed to be, some warning music starting or if it's supposed to be just the backing music for it. It's very sort of placed inside it to sort of, I guess, almost trick you to thinking if it's organic or not.
Yeah, exactly. It's keeping the player on edge, constantly wondering what they're experiencing. Like, is this something I need to worry about? Is this something that is just predetermined? It's keeping you thinking and actively engaged rather than disengaging because you think, oh, it's Resident Evil, it's a safe room, I don't need to worry. It's Silent Hill, you're always thinking, okay, what the fuck's going to happen here?
Yeah, so you hear like a scraping noise and you're not sure if that's a monster, you're not sure if that's something in the environment, you've got a puzzle or something you've got to be aware of, or sometimes there's just silence, which you're not sure if it's supposed to signify something at all.
And of course, silence traditionally in horror as well, like when something goes quiet, I think, especially recently, with regards to a lot of the movies and things that come out, silence is generally the cue for something loud to happen.
Yeah.
Because something loud isn't going to be effective if you already have something of medium volume happening in the background, so they drop it down, and then you get a loud jump scare, and then that's it. And of course, that's reflected in games as well, I think, to a certain degree. Probably not as badly, because, you play things like Outlast and stuff like that, and that probably, it lacks music for the specific purpose of being able to do that, I'd say. But still, it's uncomfortable, especially if you watch a lot of movies like me.
Yeah,
so,
I think that really, in sort of a general sense, is the biggest positive that games have over it. The diegetic sound effects that can be used. That's the benefit that games have over movies, because that, I think, along with a few other elements you can add in, is really an important way of immersing someone in the world, because it doesn't require you to actively sort of assume what the situation is supposed to be. When it's used correctly, it can really bring you in, because it's not that for sure this is what the cue is for this sort of emotion I'm supposed to feel. It just is a sound that's automatically causes your imagination to draw something, whatever that is, and that can, I think, bring a lot of emotions about in someone purely from what sound is chosen in what room at what time. I mean, we saw a few times where you just walk into a room and then there's this horrifying sound, and there's just nothing in there.
There's nothing in there. And I think, just so people have a little bit more context to what we're talking about, the music in Silent Hill isn't anything close to traditional music that you would find in anything horror.
Well, I mean, there's those parts specifically.
There are specific parts where they do go, they do use like instruments, I say in quotations, where it is like music, the sort of stuff that you could listen to. But the stuff that I'm referring to is, for a good part of the game, you're going to be listening to what appear to be like mechanical objects and like these metallic things scratching and thumping, and as I said, like making all sorts of bang. And that's the music. That is the atmospheric sort of like audio track that they're playing to this specific area. I would call it music, but some people probably wouldn't. And I think that is like what makes it especially terrifying, because it's not like you're listening to old mate play the guitar or a violin or something in the background that's cueing you into, feeling atmospheric and moody. That's where you get, because it's not something that you would ever associate as being like, that's not a soundtrack, right? I'm listening to a washing machine, as you would say, like banging on the floor, like incessantly. And that's just the track.
Yeah, Yamaoka uses sort of very, I think, harsh sounds. Like, it's very sort of industrial and almost grungy.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
So it's sort of, a lot of time, I think you're unsure as to what instrument is being used. I think a lot of time he does use like, I don't know if it's actually machines, but I think it's sort of like bits of metal and that sort of thing to create sort of scraping and sort of clashing, like almost natural sounds, I think is a good way of putting it, where for sure this is not a traditional instrument being used. Yeah. And it's...
it doesn't sound like... It doesn't sound like an instrument at all. It sounds like someone's gone and picked up a pan or something and started banging on it incessantly, just, to make a noise.
Yeah. So going back to what you were saying before about... the sort of non-traditional, in terms of not having jump scares that Silent Hill uses, I think that's really something I've always defined Silent Hill by. Like, you think of any other horror game, Resident Evil or Outlast or anything like that, there will always be a point where it tries to jump scare you with something. And just thinking of Silent Hill 2 now, I can't even think of even, maybe more than one or two, if that.
I don't even think I can think of one. people have this thing with jump scares, which I get. I don't like jump scares. They are effective for scaring people, but they're not real scares.
But see, I don't think that's scaring though. I think that's startling.
It's startling.
And that's not
Well, it's
fair.
something that
It's not like, for me, fear is something that has to be created through like an extension of your imagination. Like it has to use what you know about point A or point B, or mythology, or the ghosts or whatever.
I think a perfect example of what this game does, like in respect to that, like build, because it's building fear, right? Like that's why I say that the best horror movies are great thriller movies, because they're keeping that tension in your gut, in your chest. It's like it keeps tightening that knot in there, and it doesn't let it go. Whereas cheap jump scares, there's no knot. You're not scared, and the only reason that you might be scared is because you suspect that there's going to be a loud noise happening. And then it's just immediately over when it begins. It's a loud bang, and then that's it. You're not feeling anything more. You're just like, oh, fuck, that got me.
I mean, I think that's a good point to make, because it's just, you feel nothing when it's over, I think is the best way to put it, because...
Well, you're immediately calm, because they can't do another jump scare straight away, can they?
Yeah, well, exactly. Because, I mean, each time it's used, the less effective it is.
Exactly.
And I think the most natural response is when there's a jump scare, the emotion you feel afterwards is anger, like annoyance.
Yeah.
Because you're like, it was just a cat hiding in the closet.
Exactly.
How stupid.
If
anything, it's ruined the atmosphere.
And like there are good ways to do jump. Like there are quote unquote valid jump scares. I think I've heard this discussed a couple of times where it makes sense for it to happen, and those ones are probably less offensive. But then, as you say, like the cat jumping out of the closet, it's just, that's unnecessary, and that's something that a horror movie does in the first 10 minutes because it feels like it's obligated to scare you straight away. But back to my example. So in Silent Hill, there is a scene where I think you and I agree that the third dungeon area that you go to, the historical society or whatever, is the scariest part of the game. Which I
think it would definitely be one of.
Yeah. I think in terms of immediate atmosphere for the first 20 to 30 minutes while you're in there, it has some of the strongest. If we're looking at examples of the audio design specifically, I think that it has some of the best parts for that.
Okay, so what?
Well, the bit that I was going to break down is there's a part when your character James first enters the building and is then required to travel down this long corridor, and of course, with this game being quite old, it uses tank controls, which for those of you who don't know, you don't have the right stick to turn your character freely. You have to navigate them entirely with the left stick, which means that you have to push forward, and your character will always go forward. So you have to sort of orientate them by rotating the stick and then push forward.
So essentially, they are sort of rotated on a axis, and you have to sort of push forward to turn them to send them walking in the direction they are turned. You can't sort of freely go 360 degrees at any.
Exactly. So they'll only ever go forward in the direction that they are facing. So that means you have to constantly reorientate your character, which is slow and clumsy. And to attack, unlike most modern games where you just have a button and you'll automatically do so, you have to, similar to using a knife in, say, Resident Evil, get into a ready stance and then attack. And most people would say it's clumsy. I mean, I guess I'd agree. But something about these, quote unquote, these clumsier systems is that it requires the player to take time. There is a risk in doing so and getting ready. It takes time to react. It means that you're not going to be this incessant ready killing machine military.
Well, I think that's the problem with people complaining about tank controls. They always say, "Oh, I'm so glad they removed tank controls from the Resident Evil 1 remake because this way, I can actually, I can aim properly. I can be ready faster."
Yeah.
But they don't realize that was in the game for a reason.
Exactly. The point is, see, if you're empowered in a horror scenario, you're not going to be as scared as you would otherwise be. That is the whole point of the scenario, is to make you feel fear by not being prepared, by you not being ready, by you not being able to cope with what's happening. Okay? And overcoming it, whatever, you can solve the problem however you like, but by having obstacles in your path that further complicate the process of solving the issue, the more dread the player is going to face. So having to navigate these control issues, it means you're going to be moving slower. It means that you're going to be, taking your time with things. It slows the game down, and it also increases the atmosphere because of how much effort you're going to have to put into, carrying out whatever tasks to deal with whatever combat situation. It also means that combat isn't like some of the more recent, third-person sort of experiences that try to be horror, where it's just a single headshot and that's it. The game's over. In this, you don't have the luxury of aiming precisely. often you can't see what you're aiming at off screen because of the fixed camera perspective, which is another benefit to this game. Anyway, so you have all of these things compounding you into a very slow style, and you're moving down this corridor. And I think this corridor, it's ridiculously long. So at this point, we're walking because we want to be in a ready stance, which you can't sprint in, down this corridor, and there's a noise. And what this game does geniusly, and that I'm so happy that it does, is that it doesn't feel the need for things to be unnecessarily. It takes its time to build up an atmosphere and then hold it. Like I was saying earlier, so as you're walking down, this audio is playing of like this horrible screeching sort of a sound, like a wailing, and you don't know if it's the audio, you don't know if it's the soundtrack, you have no idea what is making this noise. You've seen some pretty disturbing sort of stuff at this point, and you're just moving down a pitch black corridor. And this corridor, working at the speed that we're working at, and at this point the player's been trained to work at a slower speed because they want to be able to react to whatever's happening, it takes about a minute to walk to the bottom. And as they do, the volume and the frequency of this noise increases to a point where it is very loud.
Like probably milliseconds apart, the sound breaks of nothing to this sound at this strong volume,
And there is no rhythm to it. There is no way of predicting when it's going to happen. It just increases in frequency and volume. And then you get to the bottom and it's nothing. There was nothing there. And for some of you, you might think, oh, that's a bit of a letdown. But think about, you just had 60 seconds where your heart was in your throat because you had no idea what was going to happen. And then nothing became of it. You know what I mean? Like, it's so much better than what we had. Like, it's so hard to describe how that makes you feel in comparison to walking down a flat corridor, music fading, jump scare, and then keep going. Like, it's one of the most fantastic, like, I remember we had to do it again, and it was like, obviously not quite as effective as when you do it, but even then you just get to notice like how it works, and as you walk down, you consciously pick up that it's getting louder, when of course it's more of is subtle, is that happening as you do it the first time? I'm sort of gushing over this, probably not explaining.
I think that's a good point, because I think of, like, when you mentioned, a hallway with a jump scare, I thought of something immediately like The Evil Within, which is filled with those really cheap scares where, you walk down a hallway with nothing in it and you can see the end even, and, there'll be something that grabs you or tries to grab you from, a gap in the wall or something like that. And I think it's just sort of that schlock horror that, I mean, maybe The Evil Within, I guess, was more going for, because it's sort of based on Resident Evil 4, which is very schlock horror. But in terms of branding yourself as a horror game, it doesn't achieve any of those heights. There's just nothing in it that you would say, this scared me, or this, even made me feel anything other than, oh, that's gross or whatever.
I think another thing that's worth mentioning as well, and thinking about it now, it's like, if someone was to say, I'm sad that it didn't amount to something, you haven't, as you said before, with a jump scare, when it happens, that's it. The tension is immediately taken from the scene, from the environment that you're within. And then it's another build up to another jump scare. This scene that I've just described, it doesn't take that away. Nothing happens. So that, it installs a sense of a lack of, you don't feel sure at any, you don't know whether something is danger, you don't know whether something is going to happen or not, but it doesn't relieve the tension, because when you get to the bottom of that staircase, you have to go through yet another door, and then more audio plays, and then more cues happen, and you don't know if it's an enemy or not. You don't know if this next doorway that you're going to go through is going to, be empty, it's going to be safe, or if you're going to be yet again put into another situation where you have more building, dreadful music and or, ambient audio or whatever playing. And I think that's a really important thing to say, because sometimes not having something is just as important as having something. So I don't know. That's what I would say to people who perhaps would get upset about something, there being no payoff there, because the payoff is there being no payoff, because it keeps your tension up.
So I find it interesting that we talk about sort of not having jump scares or surprises like that, because going through it again, like obviously I've played it before, so I sort of expected at least some parts of it to happen, but I think noticing this time was that there wasn't any part in the game where I thought where like the entire sort of expectation was really flipped. Like, I'm not sure if it's the same with you, or if anything, came to your mind, but I don't know if there was ever a point where you're sort of like suddenly surprised by something, or there was like a scare that was sudden.
Yes, there was. There was one scare very early on in the game, which I also found very interesting. It's a jump scare, but it was almost like a dynamic jump scare with regards to those crawling dudes.
That's yes, of course. I remember.
So early on in the game, obviously throughout the whole game, you're walking through Silent Hill. And, I mean, I guess some people would describe it as a sort of open environment. It's not. It's hyperlinear. But
so while we're on that point, sorry, just to stop you there.
That's okay.
What did you think of the actual town part itself? Like, apart from the dungeons, the street sort of exploration stuff.
I really liked it. I mean...
Because, that's interesting, because I think that's probably one of my least favourite parts of the game.
Well, I think I liked it because it added more legitimacy to, like, the world itself.
Because, I think it has to be there, obviously, because that's the town you're in.
But see, sort of like... So, just to say again, so the world, it's not open. Some people would say that it is, but it's not. It's hyperlinear, but you do actually get to, I suppose... explore Silent Hill. You can sort of walk around the streets.
there might be a few sort of health items
you can't really do anything outside of like fight enemies if you want to, but you're not really encouraged
so
to.
There's some on later playthroughs, there are a few extra items you can get in certain spots, but it's never quite going and finding a side quest.
Exactly. It's not like you can go to another building and explore a random building or whatever. You might be able to find an extra item hidden in the corner, or maybe there's
like a small sort of scare or little note or something.
Yeah, there might be a little side building you can get into, like that one room we got into where there was like a bunch of healing items, but nothing substantial really. And you're forced to navigate it a little bit, which is not. And I like it, as you say. I quite enjoy it just because I think when you play most games, especially nowadays, there's none of that. I feel like most environments don't feel really legitimate. Like, you go to a town, okay, in, say, some modern game, but you only ever get to see a very small fraction of the town. You never get to see the long streets. It always feels quite small and compact. Like, here's a town, but it's more like 5 houses that are neatly stacked together that, combine to create one neat linear...
Like a Skyrim town.
Yeah, exactly. It's like one small, neat, linear experience, which, you go from this house to this house, and it doesn't feel like a town. Silent Hill does. You get into the town, you start on one end, and then you end up on the other end by the end of the game, and you walk past so many buildings. Like, you get to see, okay, well, there's a bar, there's a little side corner store, here's a bunch of houses.
I find that interesting that it's not even for like being able to go and go in and meet NPCs or anything like that. It's more, here's the bar on the corner, here's the strip club, here's the the bank or whatever. Like, they are there. Like, you can say this was a town that functioned, even though you can't go and see it functioning.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I love about the game, is that it looks like something could be there. If that it doesn't feel like this is a level made for the sake of being a level. It feels like, okay, this could plausibly be a town. Like, the designers have obviously sat down and like, okay, well, we want to put that there, we want to put that there. Not necessarily to elaborate on it, but just to make the environment feel legitimate, which I really, really appreciate. And that also leads into like the level design for the dungeons themselves. I really like these old games, Resident Evil included, actually, I find, for at least the earlier ones. When you can interact with the doors, and doors that aren't meant to open, they'll just say they're locked or they're obstructed. Small details like that, where it's like, it is the developer saying, obviously, you can't go into the room.
Well, what Silent Hill does is that if you can't ever open the door, it tells you the lock's broken. Whereas if you can open it, it will say
it's locked.
It's locked.
Yeah.
So there's different text.
But what it does is it gives an in-game reason for the character not being able to get in there, which is so much more than pushing your character limply up against a wall and say The Last of Us or something, and then like, oh, well, I guess I can't go in there because my character there's no button prompt or something. What it does is it goes like, it's such a small thing, but I just appreciate it. And then you walk through, like the map in Silent Hill 2. And I don't know if it's with all the Silent Hill games. Well, I guess we'll find out.
It certainly is with the first 4. Okay. And I know at least one of the spin-offs. Yeah. I don't recall if Homecoming might have done it. I don't think Downpour does.
Okay. But it's fantastic. So basically your character will get a map and he won't have it until you find it, but generally they're at the start of each dungeon. And he'll actually mark all the rooms that you go to with little symbols that, you know, tell you if you can go in there, if you've been in there, if it's obstructed and you can't go in there. And these are like fully detailed, like they like you go into a hospital, and I feel like you go into a hospital in a lot of games, you're like, okay, it's like 6 wards and that's it. You go into a hospital in this game, it shows you the full hospital. And obviously since Silent Hill is a smaller town, it's not massive, but you still get to see all of these wards and whatnot. And even the rooms you can't get into, they're there and they're labelled. So it doesn't feel like a video game hospital. It feels like an actual place that could function.
Yeah, I mean, despite the fact that a lot of these dungeons are, you know, there's this hospital with 20 wards that you can only get in 4 rooms, it doesn't feel like you've been missing out on these rooms. It feels like they're busted, you can't get in them.
Exactly.
But, you know, sometimes you might be able to hear or see something in a room, or you might get an idea of what could be behind it from what you see in the other rooms.
Yeah, it's I don't know, it just does so much. So I can understand why Silent Hill itself would be boring, and probably on subsequent playthroughs I probably get less out of it than I would on my first
of course
time. But in terms of legitimizing the world and making it feel like something, like, I quite like it.
Yeah, I mean, it says something to the design of it where the fact that you can't access everything actually adds to the immersiveness of the area.
And having them tell you that you can't.
Yeah, like the lack of being able to explore these places almost even adds to the legitimacy of exploring this rundown old hospital. So, you know, I think these little touches really add a lot, which, going back to your point about the initial jump scare.
Yes, so sorry, we went on a massive thing. So whilst you're exploring the street, you know, this game likes to disorientate you, or at least in like the Silent Hill fog, you know, obviously there's a wall of fog, and if it's not fog, it's darkness generally, and that's a conceit for the rendering.
Especially, it was definitely in the first game. In this one, I think it's less of a conceit, but it's certainly a factor in, I think, the progressive loading.
Well, yeah, it helps as well. Like, so even if it's, regardless of whether or not it's a conceit, like for loading or rendering or whatever, it adds a lot of atmosphere, obviously, but it also does well to disorientate you. So it's not uncommon for you to go down the end of a street or a little side path and have it be blocked off, but you know, you can find health items and obviously interact with different, you know, little individual things that you can pick up, etc., enemies and so on and so forth. And on this one occasion, we were running past a car, and there is an enemy type in the game where up it's pretty well harmless, it can only spit at you, but then down on the ground it can move quite quickly and makes one of the most terrifying noises I've ever heard. And was underneath a car, and we must have wandered too close to it, and it just jumped out. But I don't think it was scripted. And, you know, it's just one of those, it was completely calm, didn't happen ever again in the game.
Well, I think the fact that, I mean, even if it was scripted, which it may well have been.
I don't think so, because we didn't have to walk down that
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. Like, I'm not sure if, you know, naturally people would probably go that way, so therefore they've had something there, or it just happened to crawl under that car at the time, or whatever. But the fact that you can't tell, I think, adds a lot to it. Yeah, so I think those sorts of little touches can add a lot to, you know, what for me. I mean, going through the town, just the streets, exploring, I found it just because they're sort of lacking visuals and sort of not lacking direction, but I think it's just sort of the vagueness of where you're not quite sure where you're going can kind of be a bit bland at times. Like, it's just sort of walk down street, there's enemies wandering around.
Certainly, I think certainly upon replaying it, I would agree with you. For me, playing it the first time, I didn't mind the disorientation so much, though I suppose I did have you as like a rough guide, though. I can understand if you've been running around the area for like an hour, it would probably get a bit dark.
I think more so for the fact that just comparatively to the actual interiors of the levels, I think those are much more tightly designed.
Oh, yes.
And provide much better atmosphere.
And especially if you do consider atmosphere, because obviously outside you don't get too much music. And then inside, the fidelity is improved as well. Like, outside you do start to notice, like, the game's aged remarkably well, but outside, not as much. Inside, when like the hospital and areas like that, obviously get.
Well, that's because it can't do that usual trick of just rendering the small spaces. So it has to sort of have, I guess, some constraints there. But going back to, I guess, what we were talking about a little bit before with the controls, the gameplay is where a lot of people, I think, falter for Silent Hill. But I think that's the big weak point of the series, or the first 4 games at least.
Yeah.
Because I think the word most people use would be sort of clunky, and
I think clunkiness works well for it. Like, if we're gonna examine it from like a gamer feel perspective, I can understand why it would feel clunky, but historically speaking, I quite like clunky in horror games, at least. Like, not every horror game has to be clunky to feel good, like to sort of add to the atmosphere. But especially in something like this, I think it works really well. And if we want to talk narratively, I think it probably makes sense for, like, he's just a guy. He's just
that's the, I guess, response that everyone, I think, uses to excuse, say, the Silent Hill protagonist's sort of, I guess, clumsiness with any of their weapons, because, at least the first 4 games, the characters are all just random people who are, they're not soldiers, they're not, army marines or anything. They're just people who have wandered in here who don't know weapons very well. Like, they know them enough to get by smacking them or just pulling the trigger, but there's no, expertise behind it.
Like, for example, how many, you're playing a modern horror game, and aiming in games isn't hard nowadays with all of the, advanced
auto aim and everything.
Yeah, like aim assist and stuff like that. So, playing something like The Evil Within, and you just headshot everything.
I mean, to be fair, in that game, you are a cop.
Yeah, I know, but even then, I think when you feel too empowered in a horror experience, like, it does definitely serve to the detriment of the experience, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't have too much of an issue with the controls. I can understand why people would find them frustrating. For me, it wasn't an issue. I think the one thing in the game, in terms of presentation, that probably... I think the one criticism that I would throw at it is the voice acting. And this is sort of the next lead into a topic. So obviously, the voice acting for Japanese titles, I think, like those dubbed titles, I don't think they've ever, Resident Evil 1 wasn't great. I don't know if any of the Resis have been great.
Well, see, that's the funny thing, really, because Resident Evil and Silent Hill have always been in English and only ever been in English.
Oh, interesting.
So the reason why the quality is not good is because they didn't hire professional voice actors.
That's right.
They literally got people off the street or, in one of those really sort of low, talent agency companies in Japan. So they didn't, outsource the voice acting to a dub company in America. They literally just got, here's the Konami voicing booth. You're American and you're American. Come in and do the voice acting in our booth.
Yeah.
Who knows if you're any good? So it's an interesting point you've raised, because I think a lot of people feel the opposite, because in the HD collection, there was an outcry because they were going to have only the new dub as part of it. But in HD collection, you can actually choose now, because of that, you can choose whether you want the original dub or the new dub with Troy Baker as the main character.
King Troy Baker.
So it's interesting, because now I have seen both dubs, and I think I'm a bit mixed. Like, I do really like the original because...
well, you said when we were talking about it that it adds a level of... I think the best example that I can give is The Lobster, if anyone's seen that film. The way they speak in that film is very alien. It's almost like they're purposely lacking inflection on whatever they're saying, like emotionally devoid. Like they don't have any emotion to give. They're just very flat. And if anyone's seen the movie, I hope you understand what I'm talking about. But you said that, like, them being so devoid of like a horrific scene has just happened, and James's voice actor doesn't have that concerned sort of, he just has a very flat sort of delivery of a line. You think that adds to the atmosphere a little bit of everyone being sort of disembodied?
I think
from the situation.
On some level it does sort of add to it, even if it's not intentional. With the sort of the stilted, I want to say stilted is probably not the best word to use.
I think stiff is probably a good way to say.
I think it's there's a point where you wonder how intentional some of it was.
Yeah.
Because I think, I don't think they were given a great deal of direction from it, but I think the fact that they were just people off the street may have been somewhat intentional to make it seem like, these are people who don't know what's going on. they've just sort of been pulled into this weird alien kind of
and
experience.
I think that's a good word for it, is that the game is alien. Like it feels alien. It feels completely removed from reality. And I guess that, if you were going to argue that the game's voice acting added anything, it added to that feeling of it being alien. So when I say I dislike it, or that it's something that I would fault, I don't want you to think that it's something that I would necessarily change. I just think that, maybe some of the emotional, hard-hitting beats, perhaps some of those moments may have hit harder if,
I don't necessarily disagree. I think it's interesting to think that and then take a look at the new dub, because while I think the voice actors are better in apostrophe, in better quality, I also think it's overacted.
Yeah.
Like, you'll see the part where James is supposed to be upset and depressed, and it's Troy Baker trying really hard, and you can see the trying very plainly, where he's got his low, deep voice and he's trying to sort of monologue with these lines, which are just very, I think, forced into this mood that doesn't necessarily always meet the game's mood.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe, but I think in some ways it can be superior, but in most ways it's probably inferior, because it's not quite the tone of the game.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that, like, especially with regards to the remake, it's like the original game, for whatever fault you want to give it, like, that is the vision of who made it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that game was made, with those voice actors, with that being put into the game, into the experience. The developer was like, this is what we've got, this is what we'll put in, and made it work. You then go to a remaster and you take something that's been made to work with something else, and then try to, get a professional voice actor to come in and then obviously do their own thing. It's not going to work. It's not going to match up. Not unless you are, like, insanely switched on to exactly what that scene is offering, and then, like, I don't know.
I mean, you'll be happy to hear that guy, I think it's Cece is his last name, the guy who played James in the original version of it. He's a huge fan of it, because I think, it's his only acting credit, and he was very passionate about it, even if he's not the best voice actor. But he was actually not paid residuals or credited for any future releases of it, so he's just been completely given nothing. So that's the Konami way, I think.
Good stuff.
Fuck's sake, to embrace that.
Fucking nonsense.
But I mean, he didn't know the HD collection was coming out with his voice in it until it actually came out.
Oh dear.
So
what? That's a different topic for a different fucking day.
So
poor James. I don't know what his name. What did you say his name was?
Guy is this
Guy. Poor Guy.
Well, I mean, the third game, they just cut out the old dub entirely. You can only see the new dub on the HD collection. Yeah. So when we play it on the PS2, it'll have the different voice acting that will be completely different from the new one.
Fuck's sake.
So it's a weird how the experience has changed.
White. Oh my gosh, you just fucking up. You have the games, just burn them onto one else. Oh, for fuck's sake. Anyway.
It's a long story. But anyway, speaking of terrible terrible stories with tragic endings, the story of this game.
Well, I think that was the intro that we just did there. I think we've turned it into a little bit more of the intro, more than an intro. So we played the game, obviously. We played it from start to finish. I knew nothing of the story, and I think you were quite astonished that I didn't know how it ended.
Well, it's one of those twists. I don't want to say it's like a Darth Vader kind of level of it, but I think if you've heard of Silent Hill 2, someone has probably already spoiled you on the twist, which, if you're not already aware, you probably should not be watching or listening to this.
Well, yes. But here's your warning: if you haven't played Silent Hill 2, and I would strongly recommend you do so. Hopefully a friend of yours has it, because it's gone for $90 Australian on eBay. So.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. But anyway, the story is James gets a letter from his deceased wife who died of an illness.
Yes.
So he goes to Silent Hill to try and find her.
And things happen, and...
It turns out that...
Now, hold on. That's your chance. Leave the podcast now. I would recommend.
Okay.
I don't know why I'm doing that.
No, probably should.
Anyone who's listened to this point has fucking...
Probably
turned it off.
Yeah, probably already is well past it. But anyway, the end is that
James killed his wife.
And he, along with some other people there, are being punished by Silent Hill, I guess, for redemption or
for the act of murder. I don't know if it's for redemption.
Well, to try and, I guess, find redemption or to their own end.
I guess, I would probably agree with that. I would agree with that.
I guess to decide what
I think it was just more of a punishment. I think it was just making them atone for what they did.
Yeah, well,
but I don't think that there was ever a redemption arc. I think that they were always destined to fail.
No, because I don't necessarily agree to that, because I think the problem was that both James and Angela and Eddie all were not, well, at least in the bad ending that we got in Water, which is the ending where James ends up killing himself because he can't handle the guilt, I suppose.
Yes.
I think all three of them couldn't come to terms with the fact that they did kill someone and were living, I guess, a half-life since that point. So, I mean, at least Angela and Eddie weren't strong enough to find it in themselves to go on. Because I think that's the interesting thing about Silent Hill is that despite the fact that it's got this oppressive atmosphere about people failing, at the end it always has sort of a small hopeful spark.
See, that's interesting. And maybe...
I think that's the Japanese in it, because they always love doing that. Because despite Silent Hill being as depressing as it is, there's those extra endings, which I was talking to you about, the comedic alien ending.
Oh, yes, of course.
Or the dog ending, which show that it's not all just that
deep, depressing, dark shit.
Yeah.
But see, that's interesting, and maybe as I play some of the others, I'll come to agree with your opinion more. But I interpreted it entirely as being like we discussed the ending where James can survive, and you and I said that it didn't feel like it was the right ending. I don't know. I maybe it's just the morbid side of me coming out, but I sort of I never thought that there was a chance that they were going to get out. I did think that it was just going to end in him dying, or it was going to end in some purgatory of him not being able to move on or move out of Silent Hill or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean that may be that may be the canon ending, because it's never brought up sort of in any future games, unlike Silent Hill 1 in 3, which it does show that the best ending is canon, which I guess we're going to try and go for to hopefully make the canons connect.
Case we can just watch it.
But I think it's interesting to consider that there's the different perspectives on whether or not James should leave Silent Hill or should die at the end.
Well, we should probably break down the story a little bit more. So James arrives at Silent Hill, has, as far as he's aware, Mary passed away 3 years ago
from an illness.
And that's all the information that we have outside, that he got a letter from Mary, as we said, which is said that she's waiting for him at Silent Hill. Throughout the story, he's obviously put through some pretty horrifying...
I find it interesting that even from the outset, that you're set up to be told this story almost environmentally only. Like you start in the bathroom where James is literally reflecting on himself in the mirror, and... I mean, there's lots of theories going around about how long it's been since he killed Mary. Because at the end, Laura says, she got the letter from Mary for her 8th birthday, but that was only
a week ago.
Yeah, so James might have only just done it. I know some people say that they think Mary's in the boot of the car, which would lead into the in-water ending where he drives into the lake with her. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, so there's that really mild sort of start, which it sort of... doesn't really tell you a whole lot.
No, it purposely doesn't tell you a lot.
And then you start sort of on the outskirts of Silent Hill. There's no entry into it that you even see. So the entire thing is set purely in Silent Hill as you sort of go through. And the starting action is you descending down sort of the
outer woodland area.
Yeah, sort of, and it's going down and down and down as the fog increases and increases.
Honestly, it's a great start to the game as well, because you hear these scampering noises of creatures or some sort of danger that you would and the walk is a long time as well. Like it took us like 5 minutes to get to like the actual graveyard, and this entire time you of course and this is almost something which I think has helped with age, is that you've played that many games that you're waiting for some sort of
you're expecting you're waiting for a monster attack, which does happen, but not till 10 minutes later.
Yeah, a little while later, but you're waiting for something to happen to incite the starting incident, to get the intrigue going, if that makes sense. It doesn't happen. It's just there to put you on edge, which is something that the game frequently does. Anyway,
I mean, I think it's interesting as we go through to look at the symbolism of what at least we interpret these parts to mean, because immediately after James comes into the town, or from the outskirts, he comes in via the graveyard where Angela is. So, I mean, that's almost sort of like... I don't want to say foretelling what's going to come forward, but it certainly sets the tone of what's going to happen. Meeting Angela here, who warns James that something's not right with the town, and we don't really know what she's doing there.
No,
she's just sort of loitering around, and it sort of sets this weird otherworldly kind of tone because she's not quite right, but you don't know why.
And once again, I think, as I say, with the voice acting, whilst not the best, it does certainly lend itself to the atmosphere at this point because, once again, Angela's not coming across as...
Too sane?
Well, no, not too sane, and then James is flat as always, but... Yeah, like I'll just quickly brush over the story just so that we have a brief outline. So, as you move in through Silent Hill, you meet up with various characters. Angela, as we mentioned, is one. Eddie is another. And then you have Laura, who's like a frequent recurring character who sort of seemingly out of nowhere pops up with an item or a piece of knowledge that James requires.
And she certainly has a lot of knowledge about Mary that is not... James, for some reason, doesn't seem to recognise her at all, even though she was apparently friends with Mary in the hospital. I don't know if that's supposed to sort of just be James's memory blocking that entire period out.
Yes. And she always has a piece of information or something that will incite. James will either, learn something from that or chase after her and it'll lead into another dungeon, etc. And then obviously we get to the end reveal. And that's sort of how the game works. And now if we want to break it down as we were doing. So when you first get into Silent Hill, your first enemy encounter, I thought it was fucking terrifying, where you get your first weapon. I can't remember the specifics of how... It was the radio, right?
Yeah, so you go sort of this part that's kind of off the street of Silent Hill and it's kind of under this little bridge or tunnel.
Yeah.
And you hear this radio static that... As you get closer, it gets louder and louder because it's this radio that's on, which is the sign that there's an enemy nearby.
I just realised something, actually, which is silly that it took me this long to realise. The radio static in the game, for anyone who's played this game, obviously knows, the static of your radio indicates that there are enemies nearby. And I just realised, and I love it, that the static is what's drawing you towards the radio to pick it up as an item. But the reason that there's static is because there's an enemy just there.
Yeah.
That's pretty fucking cool. Come to think of it, actually. Like the fact that it's not arbitrarily making a noise that it wouldn't otherwise make when you're holding it. That's pretty neat.
Yeah. So there's that first encounter there. And I find it interesting before that point. I mean, I know it's there for gameplay purposes, but there's no enemies in the street at all.
No.
It's just completely clear, which I'm not sure is supposed to be the town sort of not yet deciding what to do with you, or if it's kind of like... just supposed to be your entrance where everything's hiding and just watching you at this point?
I feel like it was... I mean, obviously from a gameplay perspective, it's, so the player can learn the rules of combat and how everything works. If we're thinking narratively, I know the way that I would sort of think about it is he's not really in Silent Hill just yet. I think he's still working. He's only just gotten through the graveyard outside of town.
Well, I think it's interesting because I don't think Silent Hill in any of the games is supposed to be necessarily unfair. I think that's the point that I was making before where for not even redemption, I think it more so gives you a kind of a chance at resolving the issue even within yourself.
Yeah.
So...
Coming to peace or acknowledgement of something that you have done and perhaps being given the opportunity to at least dying accepting something. That
or at least, I mean, in this game, in the other games it functions somewhat differently, I think, because it's not necessarily something the player character has done, or it's some particular reason the town is acting this way, I think is more accurately it. But I don't think it ever restricts you. Like, surely if the town wanted to just fuck with you, it would just lock every door and just never let you out. For instance, but it always gives you items. It always gives you weapons.
Always pushing. It has a narrative that is pushing on you and is obviously guiding you in the direction of some revelation, something to happen to teach the character something. Exactly.
Yeah. So that may not necessarily be unintentional to sort of direct the character to weapons and items
and to a specific point. Yeah. I think. Now that we're at an enemy encounter as well, it's worth talking about the enemy design because that's another thing that Silent Hill does incredibly. So, Silent Hill does something which I love, which is environmental storytelling. Like, horror games and things that can get away with being vague, I think are sometimes really bad offenders of leaving things up to interpretation and then having none of it make any sense. Like, what is this? What is this? I don't know. It somehow works within the logic of the film and or game. Deal with it, I guess. But then you get the rare occasions where a movie or a game actually work, and there's obvious thought. Like a great example of great environmental storytelling that isn't necessarily in a horror game, Dark Souls or something like that.
Yeah.
I have to bring up Dark Souls.
Of course.
That game, as far as narrative goes, it has a very loose one, I guess, but most of what you're going to be absorbing story-wise is through...
See, that's interesting, because I think Dark Souls, the way it does the environmental storytelling is sort of like, say there's an item in an area, and you sort of almost told why that item is there, either through the item description or the environment itself with, a corpse or enemies around or that sort of thing. But Silent Hill kind of does the opposite thing, which it explains why this enemy is here and what it means.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually reflect onto the environment itself.
No, but they're still using mechanics outside of direct...
Yeah, telling you.
Like, I suppose you could argue that the item description is kind of that, but the item description is less telling you something rock solid. It's more telling you what the item is, and then through that you're sort of figuring something out. So, for example, in Bloodborne, when you get like the blood echoes or whatever, and as you start to get up to the higher tiers of that, which is like Blood of the Old One or something like that, throughout the game, you obviously start to realize that it's H.P. Lovecraft related, and then you realize that blood is actually related to the old ones, and etc. and so on and so forth. You start connecting those dots without the game having to necessarily explicitly tell you that this is what's happening. So I agree with you. Dark Souls is sort of it is different than Silent Hill in the way that it does it, but I think in what it asks of the player, it's probably quite similar. It's asking them to think, it's as opposed to
and once again, one of the superior, I think, ways that games can tell stories as opposed to movies or books, where it's something you don't even need to actively focus on or search for, or that sort of thing. Like a book, something it tells you will probably have to be relevant.
Exactly.
But in a game, there's something like you could play this game and not even pick up on the enemy design being symbolic.
Yeah.
But it is there, and it is there to provide that extra depth.
And that's what I love about this, is that I knew that going in that the enemies meant something. For example, I knew the nurses going in, because obviously the nurses are quite famous. They're in the movie, the first movie. I think they're in the second movie. They're in everything. And obviously, they're sort of like the embodiment of, I think you and I decided it was James's, like obviously it was something to do with sex and sexuality, but it was sort of like the embodiment of his sexual frustration.
Yeah, I think that's essentially because in the second game at least, the town entirely is reflecting on James. I mean, at least what he sees is what represents sort of elements of his life around the time that he was with Mary.
Yes.
So, things like the nurses are his frustration because, she was frail and sick the whole time.
Yeah.
And, the nurses in the hospital, that sort of thing. So that's pretty obvious. I think that's sort of one.
But then you dive deeper into the enemy design and you start to see a whole, like, for example, throughout the game, you sort of learn about Mary being in the hospital and, certain plot and story things related to her being in the hospital and which hospitals, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. But for the longest time, we were introduced to these enemies which almost looked like they were wrapped in like a sack or something in like this weird bed frame. And for the longest time, I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And there was like an orifice of some kind. And I had no idea what it was until right at the very end, I realized that it was a bed. It was, and as you said, it was Mary wrapped in sheets in a bed.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least that's my interpretation, I think, is that it's sort of meant to be, I guess, Mary's struggle to even move or do anything at all. And sort of that, I guess, thick, overpowering kind of obstruction of movement and then when we get others, which your interpretation for the initial enemy is James. The ones who are sort of wrapped up with their arms tied up and their bodies sort of just flailing around. Yeah. I think that's more so something like James's helplessness or restriction of the situation he's in, that he can't escape, or he feels confined by the fact that he has to try and stay by Mary's side while she's dying.
And then, of course, we have the two lower torsos, so just two legs, essentially, and the sort of groin region sewed together, one on top of the other. And then that, I think, leads into sexual...
Yeah.
Because it's overtly sexual because it's focusing on, you know, a particular... And the legs, I might add, are quite feminine looking.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
That would be my interpretation. And obviously, these aren't necessarily the right answers we should add. Like, these are just our interpretations of it. But the fact that you and I can even interpret that from the enemy design itself, like, it's so much better than, you know, zombie dude with a pickaxe number 25.
Yeah, it's something where I think you can draw a lot of different conclusions out of it, even if you're just looking at like a base level like we are. Like, I'm sure there's far more in there if you go deep diving into it, which I'm sure many... channels or videos have before, but on a surface level where even if you just play through to the end and go, this is the revelation, all these things before, thinking back on them, there's a new layer added to them, or at least to most of them at least. So I think the addition of something like that can really add layers to it, and it does for at least the first 3 or 4 games, I think, absolutely. And this also sort of holds true for some of the other characters. They have sort of their own version of those as well, like with Angela and the boss, which sort of was meant to represent her dad, and the room she was in with the...
Which is something I didn't even notice on, but when you described it to me was because this game also... It has a note system, a memo system, and you can pick up notes, and it's not afraid to give you information right at the start of the game and then draw it as a reference at the last act.
And I think even this playthrough, I found it a lot more easy to connect the dots, I suppose, sort of looking at it from a more external point of view, where, you know, the note in the start about the serial killer who killed the 2 kids factors into, you know, a puzzle later in the game and that sort of thing. So I think most of the notes are used for a reason, to expand on the elements of the game.
It either expands on fleshing out the story or something like just general information on like the town itself. Most of the time reflects in like a puzzle or something that you have to solve later, or even directly relates to a character struggle with regards to what is probably one of my favourite moments once you actually explained it to me. Upon first playthrough, when there is a boss fight, sort of was it the third? It was, yeah, in the Historic Society, sort of towards the end of that area, where you fight one of the aforementioned beds with Mary, in a room with Angela, who is screaming for her. Yeah,
well, it's a bit of a different sort of one. It's not quite the same. It's more to represent her dad.
Well, I don't know, because I was going to say that it did look quite the same as James, but I think she's perhaps seeing something different.
Well, she may well be seeing something different, or it could also be representative of her in the bed with her dad.
Of course,
as he raped her. Well, I think that's more so the room itself that it's set in with the sort of all the holes, with the sort of gestating pipes and stuff.
Yeah, so you walk into the room and she's screaming for her father to stop, and then, as you pointed out to me, the room is sort of very bloody and the wall is almost like a skinny sort of texture representing some sort of physical abuse. We won't go into it too deep for the sake of graphic descriptions.
Sure.
But there's like large phallic sort of objects sort of like thrusting in the walls, and you know, it's something that sort of looks weird when you first get there, but once you described it to me, like it's funny how something so small that I don't know if it's just because I've been taught to not pay attention to that sort of shit playing in other games, but like you look at it and it's just like, it's like there's a whole little thing.
There's a weird room. Yeah.
It's like, there's a weird room, but like there's actually a whole little story thing there that you can piece together exactly what's happening. And yeah, that was probably one of my favorite moments of the game when you described that to me in post. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
And then ties again into like telling a story through an enemy, through a room, through even, you know, simple actions or something that a character's doing that is then brought into context by something that happened 6 hours ago that you read. And it's just fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I probably got a bit sidetracked there. But
that's right. So I think at the end twist, when it was finally revealed that James was the one who killed Mary, and the sort of the final confrontation and then sort of ending, I suppose, I got the impression that you weren't quite as
Okay. But do we want to go to the end yet, or do we want to run through any other story beats throughout? We've sort of covered in detail the first 20 to 25 minutes, and then sort of cut off.
Yeah, and then gone off to the end.
I mean, it's fair to say not. Like, I don't know if we wanted to run through each dungeon. Probably not, because it.
Well, I don't think there's a whole lot more to add to them besides.
It's fair to say that the level of storytelling, both environmentally and then sort of through the vague bits and pieces that you get throughout the game, is pretty fantastic. Like, in both how little it tells you and then how much you can pick up on, especially after a playthrough already, knowing a lot of the context of things that you're seeing. For example, you pointed out to me the first time we played, it's like you get the flashlight off of a mannequin which has Mary's
dressed in Mary's clothes. Yeah,
dressed in Mary's clothes. It's just small things like that really add to the experience. So, and it's that way through the first, second, and the completion of the third dungeon, and then you get to the fourth dungeon, which takes place in the hotel, and if you want to.
Well, I was going to say that we've sort of skipped over the fact about Maria as well.
Well, yes, you are introduced to a character named Maria, who seemingly
looks exactly the same as Mary.
A perfect copy as Mary, but isn't Mary, but knew Mary. And, well, did she say that?
She seemed to know something about it, which is not really ever expanded on, like if she actually knew Mary. But I know there's the extra episode which we didn't play, which does expand, I think, a bit on why she's involved in this. But I think the general idea is that the town has either used someone or has just created this person to specifically to torment James.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think that she was actually a person I don't think she was like Angela or Eddie. I think she was something like the town manifested for the specific purpose of fucking with James.
Yeah.
So anyway, throughout the story, you've encountered her a couple of times and she's died a couple of times, but comes back, and I think that furthers the point of the town creating her, because it's constantly
trying to reinforce the fact that she's dead and he is not. I mean, in the situations where Maria dies, he is not necessarily responsible, but there's the possibility that he can consider himself responsible, which reflects on Mary herself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, it gets to the end of the game, and the final confrontation happens where James obviously realizes that he was the one who killed Mary, and that throughout the entire game, he's been denying it to himself, sort of mentally blocking it out. And I love the subtleties that you pointed out to me with regards to, characters mentioning sort of offhandedly or directly to him that he looks like he could be a murderer, like Eddie, accusing him of that. And him sort of pausing for a moment and then denying the allegation and whatnot. And, small little touches like that, which sort of add, validity to the character forgetting and forcefully shutting himself down and like forgetting that even was a thing that he could ever do. The end happens, obviously, and it's revealed that Maria, spoilers, isn't nice. She's
well, whatever version that Silent Hill has created to essentially torture James,
and it turns into the final boss fight, and then the game ends where James sort of gets a little bit of closure with Mary, and then depending on whatever ending you get the ending. So I'll talk briefly just about the ending itself, sort of before we dive into some of the sort of the specifics about it. It wasn't what I was expecting. I'll be completely honest with you. I think it's the thing whenever you think of like a twist ending, whenever you think of something. Say someone's hyped something up, like this is one of the best in the genre. If I went and spoke to someone about, say The Witch or something like that being one of the best horror movies in the genre that came out over the past 10 years, they go and watch it, they're probably going to walk out underwhelmed. Yeah. And that's a realistic thing.
So were you expecting something like a bigger twist that would like change your whole perception of the game? Or?
I think I was. I don't necessarily think that that's realistic though. Sort of thinking about it now, I think... I was expecting some, like I can see dead people or something. I was
something bigger.
I was expecting something grandiose, but I don't know if that'd suit the game. I'm not too fussed about it. But at the time that I was playing it, I think I was underwhelmed. I'm unsure how much that was because of the ending itself, or if it was just because I had been built up to think because obviously, and don't get me wrong, I do agree that this is one of the best horror experiences ever made for, in as far as the medium of video games. But, I don't know if I had been built up to the point where it's like there was no way that it was going to meet my expectations, if that makes sense. So initially I was not disappointed, but I was like, oh, okay, that's the ending. He killed his wife. It's an alright twist, but it's not exactly something that we haven't experienced before. It's the subtleties in the game that I think elevated the ending for me to a point where now I look at it and I'm like, it is actually pretty cool. For one, the foreshadowing that you explained to me. I think the moment when I realized what Maria actually represented to James as well, I sort of found a newfound appreciation. I realized her inclusion in the game she was like the ideal version of
Yeah, I mean, at that point in time, I think Maria represented everything that James wanted to have in Mary. Yeah. So she was sexualized, she was open with her feelings.
Exactly. She was constantly flirting and, shut up.
She would never confident. She would listen to whatever he said.
She would shut up. She would never talk when, or do anything whenever he was doing something. She would only speak when he wanted to speak to her, as far as I can remember anyway. But yeah, she was very much, he was the dominant, he was in charge. It was him and then it was her.
Yeah.
And the second that I realized that, or at least that I sort of made that connection and then we explored it further by talking about it, I think at that point I was like, okay, I can actually see this ending as being something that is worthy of my high expectations, if that makes sense.
I think it's good to look at pretty much every facet of Silent Hill 2 in particular as a reflection of James' psyche. Like Laura, Eddie and Angela are all foils to James. Like they all, even though they have their own reasons for being in Silent Hill, they all represent a part of him that was, involved in this whole story. Like Eddie is his violence, Angela's his weakness or his sexuality, and Laura's, the innocence or the innocent sort of innocence of Mary at that time.
And probably his love for Mary as well.
So she's pure and happy. And the things that he sort of idealized in Mary,
she represents.
Yeah, she represents. Exactly. So whether or not that's accurate, I think is debatable. But the fact that
you can even interpret that,
I think the fact that it's there leads it to be a element of it for sure.
Exactly, and so sort of through that process of figuring that out and talking about it, like. I think about it now and I think that if any other game had done that ending, my reaction would have been the same. And I would have thought nothing of it. I would have been like, it's a bit of a blur ending, this cool game with cool atmosphere ended and that's it. Mm-hmm. Thinking about it now with regards to this game and everything that we've spoken about, the audio design, the presentation, the visual presentation, the storytelling, the environmental storytelling, the enemy design, all of it. And the fact that it is so tight. Like, the game is airtight. Like, you can tell that someone has sat down and planned this all out so that everything works. And I think about it now and I'm like, it's pretty fantastic. Like, I'm not going to tell you that it's the best ending of all time because I don't think it is. Like, it didn't gut punch me or anything like that. But the fact that I can sit down and think how things from 15 minutes at the start of the game can reflect on the ending in this game and have it not be something like directly spoken. It's not like a movie where it's like, look at this key. This key's totally not going to come into some relevance at the end. Like, it's just something offhanded that you read or that you experienced through, a small piece of gameplay or whatever, and have it be relevant at the end of the game, I think is just magic.
Sure.
I don't know if you agree. But.
No, I definitely do. I think, while there are issues in there, I've always been terrible at puzzles in any game. So this game, even though it wasn't too difficult,
to be fair, we did have it on easy riddles. So.
Easy riddles, yeah. Even though I also played it on easy riddles when I played it.
Hey, look, we here on Friday Night Rants and Bants like to play the games at the highest tier of difficulty.
This is the pro gamer channel here. But no, I think
New Super Mario Bros. Wii is a tough game. Old school tough. Anyone who gets that reference?
Jesus. It's going back a ways. Yeah, I think it definitely is up there in my top horror game list. I'm not sure what else would be on that list.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting list to make, but I think it's certainly up there. I know a lot of people think 3 is better. I can see if you have a connection to 1 why you might think that. But I think number 2, just with all the little subtleties, and I think Pyramid Head makes a pretty imposing kind of symbol.
It's interesting because you go into it. I went into it. Pyramid Head. I obviously knew who that was, and you think it's like the mascot of the game in a way, and I guess he kind of is, but his relevance to the story is very small.
I mean, I think in a way, like his actual appearances are not like around every corner.
No, like you experience him in the first dungeon.
Like he's not Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. No. He doesn't chase you.
You experience him in the first dungeon. Primarily, you see him in a couple of cutscenes,
and you fight him at the end.
And you fight him at the end.
Do anything.
And speaking of, that's one enemy that we didn't discuss. The relevance of which
we're doing it right now
to his psyche. Well, I need you to do that because I'm struggling to remember.
Right.
But he appears sort of predominantly in the first dungeon, then sort of appears a little bit in the following 2, and then at the end appears again, but even then only very briefly. So
you do fight.
You do fight him again, but yeah, even then that fight only took like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And he was only ever there for that. So he is recurring. And he is definitely like the force to be reckoned with within the game.
Well, I think his importance is definitely important. It's something that needs to be in the game, because I think it's sort of the whole apex of James's arc here. Because if you recall, in the Historical Society, they had the painting which showed that the Pyramid Head or design or the outfit was used by executioners back in the old Silent Hill camp.
Oh, yes, of course. And
who punished the guilty.
That's right.
So I'm not sure if they ever would have appeared to Angela or Eddie. They may well have. But essentially, the whole part that it is literally his guilty conscience chasing him throughout the game. Yeah. And then punishing him by constantly showing them murdering Maria throughout the hospital, throughout the part at the end.
And is it even... It's funny because James executed his wife in a way as well. So it works. I don't necessarily... That was my initial reaction before you explained the guilty conscience chasing. I do remember that though now. I think that would kind of work still though. Like in James sort of also being represented as...
Well, yeah, I mean, essentially it's sort of the same thing because he... I don't want to be, he was Pyramid Head all along, but he was essentially has become the executioner by punishing Mary, but the difference is that she wasn't really guilty of anything.
Exactly.
But I mean, in his mind, I suppose she was for making him deal with the misery.
Putting so much weight on him. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe in his mind, that's how he figured it, but I think the more important point of Pyramid Head is that it was there to sort of represent... from Silent Hill that this is the pain he's caused, chasing him down, trying to get him to realize that, this is what he's done. This is what he's created, essentially, through his own actions.
Yeah.
So I think, I think the game as a whole manages to cover all these points pretty well without actually explaining any of it explicitly.
People who play this game I don't know... We've probably I think we've done a pretty good job describing it.
I think if you go through every dungeon, specifically encounter all these scares and stuff, you sort of ruin any kind of mystery about it.
Yeah.
Not that I wouldn't mind going through bit by bit of it, but that's probably for another day.
No, absolutely. But what I mean is people who go and play it, it's funny because we make it sound as if it's all it's just there. But, it takes playing it all the way through and then probably having someone who's played it as well and then talking and figuring it out. Like, the game doesn't tell you all that much.
No.
Like, in regards to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, a lot of that is stuff that's, purely speculation on our part and bits that we've heard just through regular discourse with, people online, other people analysing the game, etc. So... I suppose what I'm trying to say is don't be put off by it is not giving you all of this information. You have to actually find.
Yeah, I think that the base story that's trying to tell is obviously pretty obvious.
Yeah,
but it's the little facts.
Yeah, if you want it to be anything more than just that initial reaction that I had to the ending, you need to actually sit down and think about it. Yeah, and to be honest, I think that is a really important. Like, I think that the fact that it decided to do that instead of being so overt about everything is what makes it so special.
Yeah, well, I think that's what encourages the repeat playthroughs and with going back to experiences again with the new knowledge.
Exactly.
To sort of pick up on those little points.
Yeah.
So, was there anything in the game that you would change, or?
I don't think I would change a thing. I don't think I would. I would go so far as to say, if anyone ever said they wanted to remaster it, I would just flat out say, fucking don't bother. Maybe make it 1080. But even then, I don't want it to lose the granular feeling that the PS2 has. Just literally re-release it so that it runs fine on PS4.
I would have something that's like, in a crisp, like 60 FPS.
Yeah, maybe increase like the frame rate and maybe drop the loading times a little bit. But like, honestly, I don't think I'd change anything, because I feel like, once again, with something so finely tuned and crafted, if you change anything, you risk tipping the balance. And I think that they have found a pretty darn perfect balance for this game.
Sure. Well, that's interesting because this is the second game. So I wanted to ask, as we'll probably be going to the Silent Hill 1 and 3 and 4.
And these will probably get quicker as well. So what we might do is we might do 1 and 3 together, perhaps.
Possibly. To sort of, I guess, cover those points more, because obviously there's going to be a big gap between 1 and 3.
Yes.
In terms of the quality of them.
Yeah.
So when you think about going into 1 or 2, 3, or both, what do you expect out of those? Like going into 1, I mean, it's a generation beforehand.
Okay. So working on what I know and the bits that you've told me, I was PS1, right? So we're no longer. Oh. Yeah. Did PS1 have analog?
I don't think Silent Hill 1 has analog.
No, I don't think so.
Some PS1 games will.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think some PS1 games have analog. For some reason, my brain...
Ape Escape?
Spattered. Ape Escape! I don't expect it to be... I don't know, to be completely honest. Obviously, I don't expect the visuals to have anywhere near as much impact as 2's, because 2's on PS2, which is infinitely more powerful than the PS1. I'm sure that the PS1, the first one, will have atmosphere. I don't necessarily expect it to be... I don't expect it to scare me again, but I was proven wrong with 2, so I might be proven wrong again with 1. I think that combat will probably take less of a seat. Like the 2, there was a fair bit of combat, despite, however anyone might feel about that. I feel like 1, just because of the limitations with regards to you only have like analog moving, for example, and then probably just less response because of like the age of the system. I would expect it to have more puzzles and story beats than combat.
Okay,
and
that's interesting.
I don't know, just purely spitballing here, but that like
that's good. That's what I want. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Silent Hill 3, at least, I don't know if you expect it to just be like two, but looks nicer.
Yeah, I think from what I've played of it, from the 10 minutes that you showed me, or like the first area, I expect something very comparable to Silent Hill 2.
Yeah.
Outside of like, I don't even know if I'd expect a graphical leap, but you've said it, so now I expect it.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't say it necessarily a leap, but it's certainly obviously
and
years
a
of work.
refinement.
Yeah. It does improve it. Same with 4 as well, though I think 4 has a lot more issues that will definitely crop up.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of the gameplay.
Yeah.
That's probably my biggest gripe with it.
Okay.
But we'll get to that, I guess, when we get to it. Cool. So, is there anything else you want to add to Silent Hill 2?
One more thing I want to add is I fucking love hidden triggers that can alternate endings.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to quickly mention this. We don't need to go into too much detail, but there's always that thing like when you play a game, you get an item, you want to use it. Okay, and I love that this game doesn't use all like this. There's 2 items that it doesn't use, 3 items that it doesn't use. You get a letter from Mary at the start, you get a photo of Mary at the start, and you get a knife at the start. And the knife is the key one here.
Well, the knife you get into the first dungeon.
You get the knife as you sort of meet Angela for the second time in the first dungeon. And none of those items have any relevance, like outside of the fact that they are related to some character. You got one from a character and then the other 2 relate to your deceased wife. But the fact that looking at two of those three items can trigger
I think
certain things to change in the ending.
I'm just trying to recall. I think with the letter, if you keep checking it later into the game, it actually does start to fade into just blank paper again.
Oh, wow.
So there.
I know you said that happened with the photo.
I think it happens with both of them. I could be totally wrong, but I think they all do have some mild effect.
But just small things like that, playing on, I'm playing the game and, this is an older sort of, so you need to combine items and whatnot to try and solve puzzles, and it's never overtly told to you what to do. So, you might get to a thing and is the knife relevant here? You go onto the knife, you try and use it, you might examine the knife just to make sure that, there's nothing about it that's special or abnormal. And then the fact that can contribute to what ending you get, and like it's playing on the fact that it knows that you're going to check it because you think that you're going to use it. I love that shit. I also love other stuff like there's a narration sort of a thing being said when you're walking down a hallway, and they've timed it specifically so that you get to the end of the hallway just as one of the lines is ending. And then just as you think it stops, it goes again. And then it's your decision if you stay and listen to it or go. And of course, most people are going to stay and listen to it because it's more information. You're playing a game which is not handing out information in spades. You want to absorb everything. And then that contributes to the ending as well. I think that's just really cool. I love that's using the medium to its best.
Yeah.
When you take, because you watch a movie, you have no choice but to absorb story. You have no choice but to absorb what's happening in front of you. In a game, you can turn around, you can do anything that within the game's limits. And when it takes something like that and flips it, and and asks the player to sort of not absorb it traditionally and make a decision that can directly impact it without them knowing, I just think that that's magical.
Yeah, I think that's, again, for the third time or whatever in this podcast, the fact that this is not something that's done more often is really a shame to me, because there's those few games like Silent Hill, something like Nier as well, most of what Yoko Taro does, and a few others. Normally, a lot of indie games do it, like Undertale is one of them. The fact that they use the medium in a way that really utilizes everything that's readily available to them, I think is something that's really unique and not done nearly enough. I guess if it was done more often, it would become less
special.
Novel. But I think that's one of the best parts about what a game can do, and to really stand out. And it's remembered, fondly for decades afterwards for doing something like that. Something like Nier, would have been forgotten if it hadn't tried so hard to be this unique piece of work that just stood out from just a generic game by utilizing its medium. And I think most people don't understand how to do that. So it's really nice to see that in a game where everything else is also so competent as well. That it just again adds to the whole lot of positives.
It is using the medium to perfection at that point. Like you can tell, that whoever is doing is a master in control of their craft and what they're doing is there.
Which is interesting because it's a different director from the first game. So I have to wonder how much of like the team's influence itself was involved in putting together this idea forward, whether or not that was something they had planned from years ago or something that they just came up with and sort of built on. I know it was heavily inspired by a movie called Jacob's Ladder, which is Tim Robbins.
Okay.
So if anyone's interested in Silent Hill 2, that's worth watching because it's a very similar theme and very similar atmosphere as well. With a sort of a similar twist. I don't know if I would say it's a similar twist, but it is a twist at a similar kind of level. But it's interesting the influences they take for the series, because a lot of it is very Americanized. And
that's one thing that is really fascinating about this as well, is like the Japanese interpretation of Western horror.
Yeah, which is something that both Konami and Capcom did a lot back in the day with a lot of games like Resident Evil, Devil May Cry, Silent Hill, all took this weird kind of Japanese approach viewpoint to Western culture and characters, where they're all in English, but they all have these sort of Japanese styling sort of added to it.
And it creates a fascinating blend as well. Like if it's like on the verge of being more traditional Western horror, but it's off and you can tell that you can tell it's like a mimic. It's something that's similar but not quite there. And then you start, as you know, in Silent Hill, the further you get in, the more and more you see it change.
Yeah.
I think
I think a lot of people coming into Silent Hill will go, oh, it's like your typical American horror. It's going to be a ghost girl. There's going to be, a witch or something like that. But I think the fact that it goes to sort of this weird, like cultish, bizarre horror level where the monsters don't even really make sense in terms of the logic level. There's not like, a person who's a ghost. This is like a person that's like a part of a body bag, sort of wrapped in a sheet sort of thing that's in this room full of pulsating holes or whatever. It's abstract in a way that Western horror is really never approaches.
Western horror tends to be quite literal, I think.
Yeah.
Like that, I don't know. It's horror that I hesitate to say doesn't make sense, but it's sort of like it uses a lot. It uses a lot more than guy goes into house, scary thing is in house, you move forward.
It uses horror in, I don't necessarily say a logic way, but it uses it in a way that they have to connect the dots to make this make sense. Whereas Japan will either use folklore, which is weird on its own, or they'll just go completely off the deep end and just go, like, this is from like the deepest depths of someone's brain in just abstract, nonsensical way that will never be understood by human eyes, which is kind of a bit Lovecraftian. I don't really want to use that term, but
that's fair.
But it's sort of something that you
can't comprehend.
Yeah, it's not literal in terms of its design. It wouldn't make sense in terms of this thing can stay alive as like a living monster. It's just something that shouldn't exist and that it can't physically exist, but yet it does.
Which for me personally, like I'm not criticizing Western horror. Western horror can be great. There are plenty of sort of examples of it done really, really well. But this style of Japanese horror, I'm a big fan of. I can say like the sort of the hyper complex nature of it. Which requires a lot of interpretation and stuff.
Yeah, I think Asian horror tends to be more psychologically based. Like, it's not so much the monster that's the point. It's the character who's involved with the monster and what their background or relation is to it. Whereas something like Western is usually like, someone's built a house on a burial ground or someone's set off the curse. But it's not so much the person that's done it. It's what has been betrayed or affected or been risen or whatever. So I think Japan or Asia in general really puts more emphasis on who has done it and why.
And makes it much more personal.
I think it tries for a sort of a more connected route to the actual thing haunting them. But I guess it may vary from whatever medium you're looking at or what title you're looking at or whatever. Okay, so is there anything else you want to add for Silent Hill 2?
Good game. Tower 10 IGN would buy Pac-Man again.
Okay.
No, I'd say that anyone who hasn't played it and wants to play it, go ahead, do so. It's something that it's an experience that I certainly think that people should have.
I mean, even if I think you haven't played the game and you've listened to this and you've been spoiled on it, I suppose, I still think it's absolutely worth going and playing regardless. I mean, I think I may have been somewhat spoiled on it when I first played it, but I still enjoyed it quite a lot because I think...
And it's one of those, as we said, like the benefit of this experience is that even when going in, understanding these things, you'll notice things that you and I haven't. So, you might notice an entirely different, like subtle bit of foreshadowing that we completely missed. So it's the same when you watch a movie again with a new context. You get to re-experience it and you get to look at all the clever, subtle ways that people have been hinting towards a particular revelation. So, go and play it. Experience it for yourselves. If you have a copy, if you can find a copy.
I think even if you have to, try and find a way to get the PC version or something like that.
Get that to work.
Good luck with that. I think if whatever way you can... except probably the HD collection, I would probably recommend you avoid that. Even on the PS3 patched version, I don't think it's. I don't think it's really up to par. But any console version or the PC version, if you get all the patches and fixes installed, I think it's really worth a play, even if you know the story.
Yeah.
Even just to go back to Silent Hill one last time.
Yeah.
It's worth going for.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I think that'll do for this time.
That'll do us, guys. Peace out.
we-
See you in the next fucking video. Feed.
I'm not ending it on that, but I will say that we will be going to the other Silent Hills.
Yes.
To explore those as well.
So keep your ears out for that.
Yes.
And-
I'll be interested to see what your take is on them, but
I'll be curious as well. To be honest, there's a high bar that's been set, so I'm very curious to see.
I'll be interested to see whether or not it can meet that bar. So until then,
we
will leave it.
we shall see you in the future.
All right. See you then.